All right, so the next topic that we're going to cover is a really important one. We're going to talk about the inflammatory response. The inflammatory response is a huge part of your second line of defense and also a non-specific way of getting rid of pathogens so that they don't get into your body, okay? So in terms of that inflammatory response, what you are going to have to start it is damage to cells somehow, okay? And in terms of that, that might be maybe you're out in the garden and you prick your finger on a thorn on a rose, okay, which is I think the diagram I have in the PowerPoint, all right? What that triggers for you are the signs and symptoms of an inflammatory response, okay? Part of the signs and symptoms that let you know that your inflammatory response is happening are going to be these four steps or signs. So you're going to have rubor, calor, tumor, dolor, okay? Those are the Latin forms of the word. Essentially, the rubor means you have redness. Calor means you have heat. Tumor, in this case, we're not talking about cancer. Tumor, in this case, we're talking about swelling. Dolor, then, because you have swelling, that swelling essentially pushes on free nerve endings and results in pain, okay? So in terms of that, the inflammatory response is always going to start with damage to cells somehow, all right? Whether it be damage working in the garden, whether you be at home making dinner and you cut yourself with a knife, you have essentially opened up your first line of defense, your skin, and that now can allow bacteria into your system. So your second line of defense, the inflammatory response, is going to help mediate that so that doesn't happen, all right? And in terms of that inflammatory response, after you have damage, all right, you are going to essentially release chemicals from those damaged cells, all right? And in terms of those chemicals that can be released, all right, one of those chemicals is going to be histamine. Remember, we talked about histamine when we were talking about the basophils. The histamine is kind of that signal, that red flag out there going, hey, immune guys, we got something here we got to take care of, okay? So your cells can release a little bit of histamine. That's going to trigger the white blood cells to come to the area, okay? The way it's going to trigger that, I'm going to talk about here in a minute because there's another chemical that's released that I want you to know. Kinin, all right? And both histamine and kinin work to cause vasodilation, all right? So if we go back to our signs and symptoms, with vasodilation, vaso meaning the blood vessels, dilation, getting bigger, all right? So essentially what the histamine and the kinins do is they tell the blood vessels to relax, to get bigger, to bring more blood to the area. If you bring more blood to an area, that's what results in the redness or the rubor, all right? And also the heat, okay? So in terms of that, histamine and kinin stimulate not only vasodilation, but they also stimulate the process of diapedesis. So remember I said those white blood cells have the ability to wiggle out of a blood vessel. The release of histamines and kinins in a local area is the signal to those white blood cells that now they need to escape the blood vessel and come into a particular area, all right? So in terms of that, histamine and kinin are two chemicals that are important. I also want you to know prostaglandins and leukotrienes, all right? The prostaglandins and the leukotrienes also play a role. Prostaglandins kind of feed into the histamines and the kinins to amplify that, allow for more vasodilation, more diapedesis. Leukotrienes are more involved in essentially telling those phagocytic cells, the neutrophils, the macrophages, the dendritic cells, that they need to attach to something. All right? But we're going to have chemicals that are going to be released. That's going to increase the blood flow to the area. And when you increase that blood flow and you bring in factors associated with the blood, you're not only bringing in the white blood cells, but you're also bringing in platelets. And those platelets are going to stimulate, because you've got damage to the tissue. You've got fibers that are exposed. Those platelets sit down on the fibers, and they're going to form a nice blood clot there. All right? And in terms of that, that clot will eventually progress to an abscess, all right, which is just kind of a larger area that you have a collection of plasma, white blood cells, whatever invading pathogen is in there as well, okay? So in terms of that, we're going to get damage. We release our chemicals. Those chemicals are going to increase blood flow. That's going to result in a clot happening, all right? And then what you're going to have as far as the next step in the inflammatory response, okay? You're going to have the phagocytic cells that are going to come in, okay? And those phagocytic cells, remember, are going to be the neutrophils, the macrophages, and those dendritic cells. All right? They're going to do the bulk of the work. All right? Those steps in phagocytosis that we covered in the previous video, that's going to happen here as well as part of the inflammatory response. You're going to have toll-like receptors on the outside of the phagocytes that are going to recognize the pathogen-associated molecular markers on the outside of the invading foreign molecule, and it's going to engulf that foreign particle, okay? So in terms of that, the phagocytes are going to come to the area. They're going to enter by the process of diapedesis. They're going to recognize the foreign molecules, and they're going to essentially engulf any foreign particles they come across, whether they be associated with bacteria or if it's associated with something else that came in as part of that initial damage, as part of that wound, okay? So in terms of that, the phagocytes are going to come in, they're going to engulf the foreign particles, all right? And then in terms of that, later in inflammation, you are going to have the formation of exudates, all right? Essentially pus, all right? Some of this pus and the abscess are associated with the tumor here, with the swelling, all right? And in terms of that exudate, what that does is it causes swelling, all right? And when you've got that swelling that happens, that's going to be what triggers the pain, because you're now hitting or causing pressure on nerve endings, all right? So in terms of that, we've got damage, we release chemicals, we're going to increase blood flow, the clot is going to form our abscess, our phagocytes are going to come in via diapedesis, engulf everything foreign, all right? Now as part of that, some of those phagocytes are going to end up dying in the process of taking out those foreign particles. Those dead macrophages, dendritic cells, neutrophils are in part what make up some of the pus, all right? As well as the pus is also made up of the fluid in the area. There can also be bacteria present within the pus, all right? But eventually what's going to happen, those phagocytes are going to come in, they're going to clean up the area. Eventually you'll get resolution of the damage and the infection, and you'll have repair of the damaged tissue. All right? So in terms of the inflammatory response, this is what I want you to concentrate on, specifically the steps associated with the inflammatory response. These over here are the signs and symptoms of an inflammatory response. All right? If you have any questions, please let me know.